The morning frost clung to the wooden gateposts of the Whitfield farm when 17-year-old Chloe discovered the boy collapsed against the entrance. His dark skin was ashen with cold and hunger, his traditional beaded clothing torn and muddy, from what must have been days of walking. As Chloe knelt beside the unconscious figure, she had no idea that this moment would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family's past, ignite a conflict that would divide two communities, and ultimately lead her down a path that would transform her from a simple farm girl into something she never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitfield farm stretched across 800 acres of fertile Nebraska soil, its boundaries marked by weathered fence posts and generations of hard work. Chloe Whitfield had known every inch of this land since childhood, from the creek that wound through the back pasture to the ancient oak tree where her great-grandfather had first staked his claim in 1885. At 17, she possessed the kind of practical competence that came from a lifetime of rural responsibilities, her calloused hands equally comfortable with milking cows and repairing machinery. The farm had been struggling for 3 years now, ever since the agricultural markets had shifted and small operations like theirs found themselves competing against massive corporate farms. Chloe's father, Robert Whitfield, had grown increasingly bitter about their circumstances, his conversations dominated by complaints about government regulations and changing times. Her mother, Linda, had retreated into a quiet resignation that worried Chloe more than her father's anger. This particular October morning had started like any other, with Chloe rising before dawn to handle the livestock feeding before school. The routine was so familiar that she could perform it half asleep, which was why the sight of someone lying motionless by their front gate shocked her into full alertness. The boy appeared to be around her age, though malnutrition had given him a gaunt appearance that made precise assessment difficult. His black hair was long and braided with small beads that caught the early sunlight, and despite his obvious distress, there was something noble about his features that struck Chloe immediately. He wore what looked like traditional Native American clothing, leather pants and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. "Hey," Chloe said softly, kneeling beside him and gently shaking his shoulder. "Are you okay?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises that seemed to hold depth far beyond his apparent years. He struggled to sit up, his movements weak and uncoordinated from what was clearly severe hunger and exhaustion. "Water," he whispered in accented English, his voice barely audible. Chloe didn't hesitate. She helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they made their way slowly toward the farmhouse. The kitchen was empty. Her parents wouldn't be up for another hour, which gave her time to assess the situation without immediate interference. She settled the boy in a chair at the kitchen table and quickly prepared a glass of water, watching as he drank it with desperate gratitude. His hands shook as he held the glass, and Chloe could see the prominent outline of his ribs through his torn shirt. "When did you last eat?" she asked, already moving to the refrigerator. 3 days, he replied, his English careful but clear. "Maybe 4. Time becomes ... unclear." Chloe pulled out eggs, bread, and leftover ham from the previous night's dinner, her mind racing as she tried to understand what could have brought this boy to their gate. The nearest reservation was over 60 miles away, and he was clearly in no condition to have walked such a distance without supplies. "I'm Chloe," she said as she started cooking, keeping her voice gentle and non-threatening. "Jesse," the boy replied, then added something in what sounded like a native language before translating. "Jesse Crow Feather, though that is not the name I was born with." The eggs sizzled in the pan as Chloe processed this information. "Are you from around here originally?" Jesse's expression grew complex, mixing sadness with something that might have been anger. "My people lived here once. Before the farms. before the fences. Chloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning she'd grown up on. Stories of her family's pioneering heritage, tales of brave settlers who'd carved civilization from wild prairie. The possibility that this land had belonged to someone else first was not something she'd ever seriously considered. She placed a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and ham in front of Jesse, watching as he stared at the food with a mixture of hunger and hesitation. "It's okay," she said. "Eat." Jesse began slowly, as if unsure whether the food was real or if he might be dreaming. As he ate, color gradually returned to his face, and his posture straightened slightly. Chloe found herself studying his features, noting the strong line of his jaw and the intelligence in his eyes that seemed at odds with his desperate circumstances. "Why were you at our gate?" Chloe asked when Jesse had finished most of the food. Jesse was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the beadwork on his shirt. "I was looking for the Whitfield family," he said finally. "I was told they lived here." "That's us," Chloe confirmed, though something in Jesse's tone made her uneasy. "Why were you looking for us specifically?" Before Jesse could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch announced her father's early rise. Robert Whitfield entered the kitchen in his work clothes, stopping abruptly when he saw the strange boy at his table. "What the hell is this?" Robert demanded, his voice carrying the edge that had become more common in recent years. "Dad, this is Jesse," Chloe said quickly, moving to stand between them. "He was collapsed by our gate. He needed help." Robert's eyes narrowed as he took in Jesse's appearance, his gaze lingering on the traditional clothing and beadwork. "Indian," he said, the word carrying obvious distaste. "Probably drunk or high on something. Get him off my property." "He's not drunk," Chloe protested. "He was starving. I couldn't just leave him there." "You sure as hell could have," Robert shot back. "We don't owe these people anything. They've got their own land, their own government assistance. Whatever problems he's got, they're not our responsibility." Jesse had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stood slowly, his newly regained strength evident in the dignity of his posture. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Whitfield," he sighed, his English formal and precise. "I was seeking information about my family's history. I did not intend to cause trouble." "Family history?" Robert's laugh was harsh. "Let me guess. You think we stole your ancestral hunting grounds, or some such nonsense. Well, news flash. Kid, my great-grandfather bought this land fair and square from the government. We've got the papers to prove it." "The government sold land that was not theirs to sell," Jesse replied quietly, his tone respectful but firm. "My great-great-grandfather signed no treaty ceding this territory. His name was Running Wolf, and this creek where your farm now sits was where our people gathered each autumn for generations." The tension in the kitchen was palpable, and Chloe could see her father's anger escalating. Robert Whitfield had never been a patient man, and the farm's financial struggles had shortened his temper considerably. "I don't care what some old Indian claims," Robert said, stepping closer to Jesse. "This is Whitfield land, has been for over a century. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the courts." "Dad, please," Chloe interjected, but Robert ignored her. "And I don't want you filling my daughter's head with guilt trips about ancient history," Robert continued. "We've done nothing wrong, and we owe you people nothing." Jesse's expression remained calm, but Chloe could see the pain in his eyes at Robert's dismissive words. "I seek only understanding," Jesse said. "My grandmother is dying, and she wishes to know what became of the places where she played as a child." "Well, they became productive farmland instead of empty prairie," Robert replied bluntly. "Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." Chloe watched in dismay as Jesse nodded politely and moved toward the door. The boy's dignity in the face of her father's hostility made her ashamed of her family's behavior. "Wait," she called out, following Jesse to the porch. "I'm sorry about my father." He's been under a lot of stress lately. Jesse turned to face her, and for a moment, his careful composure slipped to reveal the hurt beneath. Your father speaks the truth in one way, he said. This is not my fight to win. But thank you for the food, Chloe Whitfield. Your kindness will not be forgotten. As Jesse walked slowly down the farm's long driveway, Chloe felt a strange pull to follow him, to learn more about his story and the history he represented. But her father's voice from behind stopped her. Don't even think about it, Chloe, Robert warned. That boy is trouble, and his people are nothing but a drain on society. You stay away from him and his kind. The rest of the day passed in an uncomfortable atmosphere, with Chloe unable to concentrate on her schoolwork or farm chores. Jesse's words about his grandmother and the ancestral significance of their land had planted questions in her mind that she couldn't ignore. That evening, she found herself researching local Native American history on the family's old computer, discovering details about the region's indigenous population that had never been mentioned in her school textbooks. The Purpur Ponca tribe had indeed lived in this area for centuries before European settlement. The federal government had forcibly relocated most of them to Oklahoma in the 1870s, but some families had remained or returned over the years. The more Chloe read, the more uncomfortable she became with her family's role in this history. 3 days later, Jesse returned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chloe was working in the barn when she spotted him walking up the driveway, his gait steadier than before, but still carrying an air of uncertainty. This time he was accompanied by an elderly woman who moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, leaning on a walking stick carved with intricate designs. Robert was in town picking up supplies, which meant Chloe could speak with them without immediate interference. She approached cautiously, unsure of their intentions, but curious about what had brought them back. Hello, Chloe Whitfield, Jesse said formally. This is my grandmother, Margaret Crowfeather. She wished to see the land of her childhood before. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The elderly woman's health was failing, and this might be her last opportunity to visit places that held significance for her. Margaret Crowfeather was tiny, probably not much over 5 feet tall, but she radiated a presence that commanded respect. Her silver hair was braided with colorful ribbons, and her dark eyes held a sharpness that suggested a mind still keen despite her physical frailty. Child, Margaret said to Chloe, her voice carrying a slight accent, but her English clear. My grandson tells me you showed kindness when others showed only anger. This speaks well of your heart. Chloe felt herself blushing under the old woman's direct gaze. Anyone would have helped someone who was hungry. Margaret's smile suggested she knew better. Not anyone, child. Kindness is a choice, especially when it carries risk. The old woman's eyes moved to survey the farmyard, taking in the barn, the house, and the fields beyond with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been nostalgia. This creek, Margaret said, pointing toward the water that wound through the Whitfield property, was called Singing Waters by my people. We came here each autumn when the leaves turned, to harvest wild rice and prepare for winter. Chloe followed Margaret's gaze, trying to imagine the land as it had been before her family's arrival. What happened to your people? Why did they leave? Jesse. And Margaret exchanged a look that carried generations of pain and knowledge. We did not leave willingly, Margaret said simply. The soldiers came and said we must go to Oklahoma, that this land was no longer ours. Many died on that journey. Those who survived learned to live in a place that was not home. But you came back, Chloe observed. Some of us came back, Margaret confirmed. When we could. When the law allowed. But the land was changed, divided, into squares and owned by papers we had never signed. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Robert's truck coming up the driveway. Chloe felt her stomach tighten, knowing her father's likely reaction to finding Jesse and his grandmother on their property. "You need to go," she said urgently. "My father will be furious if he finds you here." But Margaret Crowfeather seemed in no hurry to leave. She approached the creek bank slowly, kneeling with Jesse's help to touch the water with her weathered fingers. "Grandmother," Jesse said quietly, "we should honor the girl's wishes and leave." Margaret nodded but remained by the water for another moment, her lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer or blessing. When she finally stood, with Jesse's assistance, there were tears on her cheeks. Robert's truck door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and his voice carried clearly across the farmyard. "What the hell did I tell you about these people, Chloe?" As Robert stormed toward them, his face red with anger, Chloe made a decision that would change the course of her life. Instead of stepping back and allowing her father to drive Jesse and Margaret away, she moved to stand beside them, creating a human barrier between the elderly woman and Robert's advancing fury. "They just wanted to see the creek, Dad," Chloe said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She's an old woman visiting a place that meant something to her family." "I don't care if she's the Queen of England," Robert shouted. "This is private property, and they're trespassing. Get off my land before I call the sheriff." Margaret looked up at Robert with eyes that held no fear, only sadness. "We will go," she said quietly. "But first, may I ask you a question?" Robert's anger seemed momentarily checked by the old woman's calm dignity. "What? Do you know the story of how your family came to own this land?" "My great-grandfather homesteaded it," Robert replied tersely. "Legally and legitimately." Margaret nodded slowly. "And do you know what became of the people who lived here before your great-grandfather arrived?" "That's ancient history," Robert said, but some of the heat had gone out of his voice. "History is never ancient for those who lived it," Margaret replied. "My father was born in the lodge that stood where your barn now sits. He was forced to watch soldiers burn our village before marching us away at gunpoint." The silence that followed this statement was heavy with implication. Chloe could see her father struggling with information that didn't fit his comfortable narrative of pioneer settlement and manifest destiny. "That's got nothing to do with me," Robert said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Perhaps not," Margaret agreed. "But it has everything to do with this land, and with the responsibility that comes with calling it home." As Jesse helped his grandmother back to the road, Margaret paused to look directly at Chloe. "You have a good heart, child," she said. "Trust it, even when others tell you not to." That evening, as Chloe lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she found herself thinking about Margaret Crowfeather's words and the profound sadness in the old woman's eyes. The comfortable assumptions about her family's history had been shattered, replaced by uncomfortable questions about justice, ownership, and moral responsibility. Outside her window, she could hear the creek that Margaret had called Singing Waters, its gentle murmur carrying new significance in the darkness. Chloe had no way of knowing that this encounter was just the beginning, that forces were already in motion that would soon force her to choose between the world she'd always known and a truth that would demand everything she had to give. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Chloe's high school in the form of Dr. Patricia Monroe, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Nebraska, who was documenting oral histories of displaced Native American communities. She'd come to speak to the senior history class about the indigenous peoples of the region, a topic that had never been covered in their standard curriculum. Chloe sat in the back of the classroom, her attention riveted as Dr. Monroe described the systematic removal of native tribes from Nebraska during the late 1800s. The academic language couldn't disguise the brutality of what had occurred. Entire communities uprooted, families separated, and ancestral lands redistributed to white settlers through government programs that had operated under the thin veneer of legal authority. The Ponca removal of 1877 was particularly tragic. Dr. Monroe explained, clicking through slides that showed historical photographs of the forced march. Over 700 people were compelled to leave their homeland and relocate to Oklahoma. Many died during the journey, including Chief Standing Bear's son. A student in the front row raised her hand. But wasn't this all legal? I mean, the government had the right to redistribute land for settlement, didn't they? Dr. Monroe's expression grew thoughtful. That's an excellent question that gets to the heart of how we define legality versus morality. The federal government claimed authority over these lands, but many of the treaties used to justify removal were signed under duress or with tribal representatives who had no authority to cede territory. From the perspective of international law today, many of these actions would be considered illegal occupation. After class, Chloe approached Dr. Monroe with questions that had been burning in her mind since meeting Margaret Crowfeather. Dr. Monroe, if someone's family farm was built on land that was taken from native people, what kind of responsibility do current landowners have? The anthropologist studied Chloe with interest. That's a profound question that many communities are grappling with today. Are you asking from a theoretical perspective, or is this personal? Chloe hesitated, unsure. How much to reveal? Personal, I guess. My family has farmed the same land for over a century, but I recently learned that it might have been Ponca territory originally. The Whitfield farm, Dr. Monroe said, recognition dawning in her eyes. You're Robert Whitfield's daughter. Chloe nodded, surprised by the recognition. I've been working with the Crowfeather family to document their oral history, Dr. Monroe explained. Jesse and his grandmother Margaret have mentioned your family's land several times. It holds significant cultural importance for their people. What kind of importance? Dr. Monroe glanced around the empty classroom before continuing. According to tribal memory, your family's property includes a sacred site where the Ponca held autumn ceremonies for generations. The creek that runs through your land was considered a spiritual center, a place where young people underwent coming of age. Rituals. Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. Jesse mentioned something about autumn gatherings, but he didn't say anything about sacred sites. Jesse might not know all the details, Dr. Monroe said. Margaret is one of the last generation to have heard these stories directly from elders who lived on the land. Much traditional knowledge was lost during the forced relocation period. That evening, Chloe found herself unable to concentrate on homework or farm chores. The revelation that her family's property might contain sacred sites added a new dimension to an already complex situation. She kept thinking about Margaret Crowfeather's tears when she touched the creek water, understanding now that the emotional significance went far deeper than simple nostalgia. Her parents were in the living room, watching television when Chloe joined them, carrying the weight of Dr. Monroe's revelations. Dad, she began carefully, do you know anything about Native American ceremonies that might have taken place on our land? Robert looked up from his newspaper with irritation. Not this again, Chloe. I thought we settled this nonsense about Indians and land claims. I'm not talking about land claims, Chloe said. I'm talking about understanding the history of the place where we live. The history that matters is the history of the Whitfield family working this land for 4 generations. Robert replied firmly, whatever happened before, that is irrelevant to our lives now. Linda Whitfield, who had been silent during most discussions about Jesse and his grandmother, finally spoke up. Robert, maybe we should listen to what Chloe has learned. It might be important. Robert turned to stare at his wife with surprise. Linda rarely contradicted him, especially on matters he considered settled. I met with a university professor today who studies Native American history. Chloe continued, encouraged by her mother's support. She said our property might include sites that were sacred to the Ponca people. Sacred sites, Robert scoffed. Every rock and tree was sacred to them, if you believe their stories. It's a convenient way to claim they have special rights to land they lost fair and square. They didn't lose it fair and square, Chloe said, her voice growing stronger. They were forced off at gunpoint by federal soldiers. Their children died. On the march to Oklahoma. That's ancient history, Robert insisted. It has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us if we're living on land where people were murdered. Chloe shot back, her frustration finally boiling over. The argument that followed was the worst fight Chloe had ever had with her father. Robert accused her of being brainwashed by liberal professors and ungrateful for the sacrifices previous generations had made to build their farm. Chloe accused him of willful ignorance and moral cowardice. Linda tried unsuccessfully to mediate between them, but the fundamental disagreement ran too deep for easy resolution. The fight ended with Robert storming out to the barn and Chloe retreating to her room, both of them angry and hurt. As she lay in bed that night, Chloe could hear her parents arguing in low, tense voices through the thin walls. The conflict over Jesse and his grandmother's claims was tearing at the fabric of her family. 2 days later, Jesse appeared at the farm again, but this time he came with purpose beyond his grandmother's nostalgic visit. He carried a leather satchel that contained documents and photographs, evidence he'd been gathering to support his family's historical claims. Chloe met him at the gate before he could approach the house, knowing her father's likely reaction to another unannounced visit. "I need to show you something," Jesse said without preamble, his usual formal politeness replaced by urgency. "My grandmother is getting worse, and there are things she wants you to know before it's too late." He opened the satchel and pulled out a collection of old photographs, some so faded they were barely visible. The images showed native families in traditional dress standing beside the very creek that ran through the Whitfield property. "This photograph was taken in 1871, Jesse explained, pointing to one particularly clear image. 6 years before the forced removal. That lodge in the background stood where your barn is now." Chloe studied the photograph with fascination and growing unease. The people in the image looked happy and prosperous, their clothing elaborate and well-made. It was impossible to reconcile these vibrant faces with her father's dismissive characterization of lazy, primitive people. "Here," Jesse said, producing another document. "This is a copy of a letter written by my great-great-grandfather to the Indian agent in 1876. He was trying to negotiate permission for his people to remain on this land, offering to share it with incoming settlers." Chloe read the letter slowly, struck by its eloquent English and reasonable tone. Running Wolf had proposed a cooperative arrangement that would have allowed both native families and white homesteaders to use the land sustainably, sharing resources and knowledge for mutual benefit. "What happened to this proposal?" Chloe asked. "The Indian agent never responded," Jesse said bitterly. 6 months later, the soldiers came with orders to remove all Ponca from the territory. Running Wolf was told that the decision had already been made and that resistance would be met with force. Jesse pulled out a final document, this one more recent. "This is a genealogical study that traces my family's connection to this specific area. We have documentation going back 7 generations, all tied to this creek and the surrounding prairie." As Chloe examined the family tree, she began to understand the depth of Jesse's connection to this land. His ancestors hadn't simply lived in the general region, they had been born, raised, married, and buried within a few miles of where she now stood. "Why are you showing me this?" Chloe asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because my grandmother is dying," Jesse said, his careful composure finally cracking to reveal the pain beneath. "And because she believes you might be the key to healing the wound that has festered here for over a century." "I don't understand. What could I possibly do?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring at the creek that held such significance. "For his family. She wants to perform a ceremony here before she dies. A ritual to honor our ancestors and ask their forgiveness for leaving this place unprotected for so long." Chloe felt her heart sink. "Jesse, my father would never allow that. He barely tolerates you visiting, let alone conducting ceremonies on our property." "I know," Jesse acknowledged. "That's why she's not asking your father for permission. She's asking you." The weight of Jesse's request settled over Chloe like a heavy blanket. Granting permission for a native ceremony on family land would be a direct betrayal of her father's wishes and everything he believed about their family's rights and history. When would this ceremony take place? Chloe asked, surprised to hear herself considering the possibility. "During the autumn full moon," Jesse replied. "In 3 weeks. It's the same time of year when our people traditionally gathered here for coming-of-age rituals." Chloe's mind raced with the implications of what Jesse was asking. Such a ceremony would undoubtedly draw other tribal members, creating exactly the kind of situation her father most feared. But the alternative, allowing Margaret Crowfeather to die without this final connection to her ancestral home, seemed equally unthinkable. "I need time to think about this," Chloe said finally. Jesse nodded, understanding the difficulty of her position. "My grandmother said you would need time. She also said that the right decision is rarely the easy one." As Jesse prepared to leave, he handed Chloe one final item from his satchel, a small piece of beadwork that looked very old. "This belonged to my great-great-grandmother," he explained. "She made it from porcupine quills and glass beads traded from French merchants. She wore it during her wedding ceremony, which took place beside this creek in 1869. Chloe held the delicate piece carefully, amazed by the intricate workmanship and the weight of history it carried. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because my grandmother believes you have a good heart," Jesse said simply. "And because she wants you to understand that this land holds love as well as sorrow." That night, Chloe researched Native American religious practices and the legal issues surrounding sacred sites on private property. What she learned both alarmed and enlightened her. While property owners generally had the right to exclude others from their land, federal laws existed to protect Native American religious freedom, including access to sacred sites under certain circumstances. More troubling was the discovery that several farms in their county had become the subject of legal challenges from tribal organizations seeking to establish cultural preservation areas. The conflicts had divided communities and destroyed lifelong friendships, with neither side willing to compromise on fundamental principles. As she stared at the beadwork Jesse had given her, Chloe realized she was being asked to choose between loyalty to her family and recognition of a deeper, older claim to the land they called home. The decision would define not only her relationship with her parents, but her understanding of justice, history, and her own moral character. Outside her window, the creek continued its ancient song, carrying with it the memories of all who had lived beside its banks. In 3 weeks, Margaret Crowfeather would ask to return to this sacred place one final time. And Chloe would have to decide whether love and justice were worth the price of betraying everything her father believed to be true. The town of Millbrook had always prided itself on being a quiet, peaceful community where neighbors knew each other and controversies were rare. That changed dramatically when word spread about the Whitfield farm situation through the intricate network of small-town gossip. By the end of the week, what had begun as a private family matter had become the subject of heated debates in coffee shops, church halls, and school board meetings. Chloe first became aware of the broader community interest when she arrived at school to find a group of protesters gathered outside the building. Their handmade signs read "Protect Our Heritage" and "Stop Historical Revisionism," while a smaller counter-protest displayed messages like "Honor Indigenous Rights" and "Truth Before Comfort." The sight of her quiet farming community divided into opposing camps was surreal and deeply disturbing. Chloe had never imagined that Jesse's simple request could generate such widespread controversy, but apparently Dr. Monroe's research had been discussed at a recent city council meeting. and details about the Crow-Feather family's claims had somehow become public knowledge. Principal Anderson intercepted Chloe as she tried to navigate through the crowd toward the school entrance. "Miss Whitfield, I need to speak with you in my office immediately." The principal's office felt smaller than usual with Anderson, Chloe, and two men she didn't recognize crowded around the desk. Anderson introduced them as Mayor Thompson and City Attorney Bradley, both wearing expressions of serious concern. "Chloe," Mayor Thompson began, "we understand you've been in contact with members of the Crow-Feather family regarding claims to your family's property." "Jesse came to our farm asking for help," Chloe replied carefully. "His grandmother wanted to see the land where she grew up before she dies." City Attorney Bradley leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield, are you aware that encouraging Native American claims to private property could open this entire county to legal challenges? There are federal laws that protect tribal religious sites, and if the Crow-Feather family establishes a legitimate claim, other families could lose their land." The weight of this revelation hit Chloe like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on Margaret Crow-Feather's personal request that she hadn't considered the broader implications for their community. "I wasn't encouraging anything," Chloe said defensively. "I just listened to their story." "Listening can be interpreted as validation," Attorney Bradley replied. "And validation can be used as evidence in legal proceedings. The safest course of action for everyone involved is to have no further contact with these people." Mayor Thompson nodded agreement. "Chloe, I've known your family for years. Your father is a good man who's worked hard to build something lasting. Don't let outsiders manipulate you into jeopardizing that legacy." The meeting ended with a stern warning about the legal and financial risks of entertaining Native American land claims. Chloe left the office feeling overwhelmed and confused, uncertain whether the adults were genuinely concerned about community welfare or simply protecting their own interests. That afternoon, she found herself driving to the small apartment complex on the outskirts of town where Jesse lived with his grandmother. The building was old and poorly maintained, a stark contrast to the comfortable farmhouse where Chloe had grown up. Jesse answered her knock with surprise and wariness. "Chloe, is everything all right? Can I talk to your grandmother?" Chloe asked. "There are things I need to understand before I make my decision." Jesse led her to a small living room where Margaret Crow-Feather sat in a worn recliner, wrapped in a colorful quilt. The old woman looked frailer than she had just days earlier, her breathing labored and her skin pale. But her eyes remained sharp and knowing. "Child," Margaret said with a weak smile, "you carry the weight of difficult choices. Sit with me and let us talk." Chloe settled into a chair across from Margaret, acutely aware that she might be speaking with a dying woman whose final wishes hung in the balance of her decision. "Mrs. Crow-Feather, people in town are saying that if I help you with the ceremony, it could lead to legal challenges that might force families to give up their land. Is that true?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands smoothing the quilt across her lap. "Truth has many faces, child. The face that frightens your neighbors is real. There are laws that protect sacred sites, and lawyers who might use those laws in ways that hurt innocent people. Then why are you asking me to take that risk?" "Because there is another face of truth," Margaret replied. "The truth that says some things matter more than legal ownership. The truth is that healing old wounds requires courage from those who benefit from those wounds." Jesse, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned to face them. "Grandmother, maybe we should tell Chloe about the others." Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, she should know. "What others?" Chloe asked. "There are 12 other families from our tribe who have connections to land in this county," Jesse explained. "Some have been talking with lawyers about filing claims for access to burial sites in sacred areas. If those cases go forward, they could affect dozens of properties." Chloe felt her stomach drop. "Are you threatening me? Saying that if I don't help you, these other families will sue?" No, Margaret said firmly. We are saying the opposite. If you help us perform this ceremony, if you show that healing can happen through understanding rather than lawsuits, it might convince the others to seek cooperative solutions instead of legal ones. The implications of Margaret's words slowly sank in. Chloe's decision wouldn't just affect her own family. It could set a precedent that either encouraged reconciliation or escalated conflict throughout their entire region. What exactly would this ceremony involve? Chloe asked. Margaret's eyes brightened slightly. 4 hours, from sunset to moonset. Traditional songs, prayers for our ancestors, and a blessing for the land. Perhaps 20 people from our community. All family members who carry the blood of those who lived here before. And after the ceremony? We ask for nothing more, Margaret assured her. This is about honoring the past, not claiming the future. We want to say goodbye properly, to let our ancestors know they are not forgotten. Jessie added, Dr. Monroe has offered to document the ceremony as part of her research. It would create an official record showing that our family's claims have been acknowledged and resolved through cooperation rather than conflict. As Chloe drove home, she found herself thinking about the faces of the protesters outside her school. Her decision would inevitably disappoint one side or the other, but Margaret's suggestion that cooperation might prevent broader legal challenges gave her hope that there might be a path forward that served everyone's interests. That evening, she approached her mother in the kitchen while Robert was still working in the barn. Linda had been unusually quiet since the arguments about Jessie began, and Chloe sensed that her mother's feelings about the situation were more complex than she'd initially revealed. Mom, can I ask you something? Linda looked up from the dishes. She was washing, her expression cautious. Of course, honey. Do you think Dad is right about all this? About Jessie and his grandmother? Linda was quiet for a long moment, her hand still in the soapy water. Your father is a good man, Chloe, but he sees the world in very simple terms. Right and wrong, legal and illegal, us and them. Sometimes life is more complicated than that. What do you mean? Linda dried her hands and sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Chloe to join her. Before I married your father, I worked as a social worker in Omaha. I saw a lot of families who'd been displaced by urban development, people who lost their homes to highway construction or downtown renewal projects. Chloe had never heard this story before. Her mother rarely talked about her life before marriage. One case stayed with me, Linda continued. An elderly Polish woman who'd lived in the same house for 60 years. The city condemned her neighborhood to build a shopping mall, and she fought the eviction for 3 years. When she finally lost, she asked if she could visit her old garden one last time before they tore down the house. Did they let her? No. The developers said it was too much liability, too much trouble. She died 6 months later, and her daughter told me she never stopped talking about that garden, about the tomatoes her husband had planted before he died. Linda reached across the table to take Chloe's hand. I've been thinking about that woman a lot lately, about what it means to lose the place where your life happened, where your loved ones are buried in your memory, if not in the ground. You think I should help them? I think, Linda said carefully, that showing mercy is never wrong, even when it's complicated. But I also know that your father won't see it that way. The conversation was interrupted by Robert's return from the barn, his boots heavy on the kitchen floor. He took one look at their serious expressions and immediately became suspicious. What are you two plotting? We were just talking, Dad, Chloe said. About what? Linda stood up and moved back to the sink. About the harvest schedule. Robert studied their faces for another moment, then shrugged and headed for the living room. But Chloe had seen something in her mother's eyes, a quiet support. That gave her courage for what she was beginning to realize she had to do. The next morning brought an unexpected complication in the form of Tom Bradley, a local attorney who appeared at their door with a legal document. He explained that several community leaders had pooled resources to hire him to draft a restraining order that would prevent any Native American ceremonies on private property within the county. "This is for your own protection, Robert," Bradley explained as he spread the papers across the kitchen table. "If you sign this, it creates a legal barrier that prevents you from being pressured into allowing activities that could compromise your property rights." Robert read through the document eagerly, nodding approval at its contents. "This makes sense. Sign me up." "Wait," Chloe interjected. "Doesn't this prevent any ceremony, even if the landowner wants to allow it?" Bradley nodded. "That's the point. It removes the temptation to make emotional decisions that could have serious legal consequences." "But what if someone wants to allow a ceremony? What if they think it's the right thing to do?" "Then they're free to move somewhere else," Bradley replied bluntly. "This community has a right to protect itself from outside agitation." As Robert reached for a pen to sign the restraining order, Chloe realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. In a few minutes, the decision would be taken out of her hands entirely, and Margaret Crowfeather would die without ever returning to the sacred site of her childhood. "Dad, wait," Chloe said urgently. "Before you sign that, I need to tell you something." Robert paused, pen halfway to paper. "What now?" "Margaret Crowfeather is dying. She's an old woman who just wants to say goodbye to the place where she was born. If you sign that paper, you're condemning her to die without ever seeing her homeland." "Again, that's not my problem," Robert replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It is if we're decent human beings," Chloe shot back. "How would you feel if someone prevented you from visiting Grandpa's grave?" The comparison seemed to hit Robert unexpectedly. His own father was buried in the county cemetery, and he visited the grave religiously every Memorial Day. "That's different," Robert said, but he set down the pen without signing. "How is it different?" Chloe pressed. "Because she's Native American? Because her ancestors are buried in unmarked graves instead of a formal cemetery?" The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Bradley cleared his throat impatiently, but Robert waved him off. "I need to think about this," Robert said finally. "Think fast," Bradley warned. "This offer won't stay open indefinitely." After the attorney left, the Whitfield family sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the weight of an impossible decision. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees that had witnessed generations of human joy and sorrow, keeping their secrets and waiting to see what choices the living would make in honor of the dead. The full moon was only 1 week away when Margaret Crowfeather collapsed in her apartment, prompting an emergency hospitalization that cast new urgency over an already tense situation. Jesse called Chloe with the news, his voice tight with worry and barely controlled emotion. "The doctors say she might have days, maybe a week at most," Jesse explained over the phone. "Her heart is failing and her lungs are filling with fluid. She keeps asking about the ceremony, whether it will happen before she dies." Chloe felt her chest tighten with a mixture of sympathy and pressure. "Jesse, my father still hasn't decided about signing the restraining order. And even if he doesn't sign it, he hasn't given permission for the ceremony either." "I know," Jesse replied quietly, "but my grandmother asked me to tell you something. She said that sometimes the right path reveals itself only when we're brave enough to take the first step." That evening, Chloe made a decision that would change everything. She drove to the hospital in Lincoln, telling her parents she was visiting a sick classmate. The 2-hour journey gave her time to think about what she wanted to say to Margaret, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight of the elderly woman connected to oxygen tubes and heart monitors. Margaret's eyes opened when Chloe entered the room, and despite her obvious weakness, she managed a smile that radiated warmth and gratitude. "You came," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the hospital machines. "I had to," Chloe replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. "I needed to ask you something." Margaret nodded weakly, encouraging her to continue. If I help you with the ceremony, if I convince my father to allow it, what happens to me afterward? My family, my community, everyone I've ever known will see me as a traitor. Is your peace worth destroying my life? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her gaze remained steady. Child, I would never ask you to sacrifice your happiness for mine. But let me tell you something that might help you understand. She paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking clearly exhausting her. When I was your age, during the forced removal, there was a white family named the Brennans who lived near our village. Patrick Brennan was an Irish immigrant who had faced his own persecution in the old country. When the soldiers came to march US away, his wife Catherine ran out and pressed food into our hands, crying and apologizing for what was being done to us. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued the story. The other white settlers shunned the Brennans after that. They called Catherine an Indian lover and made their life difficult for years. But do you know what happened to their children? Chloe shook her head. They grew up to be leaders in their community, respected for their courage and moral clarity. People eventually forgot the controversy, but they never forgot that the Brennans stood up for what was right when it mattered most. Margaret reached out with a trembling hand to touch Chloe's arm. Sometimes, child, what looks like destroying your life is actually the beginning of becoming who you were meant to be. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who needed to check Margaret's vital signs. As Chloe prepared to leave, Margaret called her back. There's something else you should know, Margaret said. Jesse hasn't told you the whole truth about why this ceremony matters so much. What do you mean? It's not just about saying goodbye to the land, it's about him. Jesse has been chosen by our tribal council to become a medicine keeper, one of the guardians of our traditional knowledge. But he cannot accept this role until he completes a ritual connection to his ancestral homeland. Chloe felt a new weight settle on her shoulders. So if the ceremony doesn't happen, Jesse loses his chance to carry forward centuries of cultural knowledge that could die with my generation, Margaret confirmed. The ceremony isn't just my last wish, child. It's his future. The drive home was the longest 2 hours of Chloe's life. Margaret's revelation about Jesse's potential role as a medicine keeper had transformed her understanding of what was at stake. This wasn't simply about an old woman's sentimental desire to revisit her childhood home. It was about the survival of an entire cultural tradition. She arrived at the farm to find her parents waiting in the living room with expressions of serious concern. Her father held a piece of paper that made her stomach clench with dread. Where were you, Chloe? Robert asked, his voice carefully controlled. I told you, visiting a sick friend. Which friend would that be? Robert pressed. Because I called 3 of your classmates' mothers, and none of them knew anything about anyone being sick. Chloe realized she'd been caught in her lie, but she was too emotionally drained to fabricate another story. I went to see Margaret Crowfeather in the hospital. Robert's face darkened with anger and disappointment. After everything we've discussed, after all the warnings about getting involved with these people, you went behind our backs to see her? She's dying, Dad. She might have days left. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change anything, Robert replied coldly. In fact, it makes my decision easier. He held up the paper he'd been holding. I signed the restraining order this afternoon. There will be no Native American ceremonies on our property or anyone else's in this county. Chloe felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Dad, you can't do this. Margaret Crowfeather will die without ever returning to her homeland. That's not my responsibility, Robert said firmly. My responsibility is to protect this family and our property from people who want to take what we've worked for. No one wants to take anything, Chloe protested. They just want to perform a ceremony to honor their ancestors. Today it's a ceremony, Robert shot back. Tomorrow it's a legal claim to sacred sites. Next year it's a lawsuit to force us off our land entirely. I won't be the fool who opens that door. Linda, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Robert, maybe we should reconsider. The girl's not asking for much." "The girl is asking for everything," Robert replied sharply. "She's asking me to validate claims that could destroy this family's future. I won't do it, and I won't let Chloe do it either." He turned to face his daughter directly. "You are forbidden from having any further contact with Jesse Crowfeather or his grandmother. If I find out you've disobeyed me on this, there will be serious consequences." That night, Chloe lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the implications of her father's ultimatum. The restraining order had effectively ended any possibility of Margaret's ceremony, but it had also crystallized something in Chloe's mind about the kind of person she wanted to be. The next morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of her high school teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who had been following the controversy with interest. She approached Chloe after American history class with a suggestion that offered a potential solution. "Chloe, I've been thinking about this situation with the Native American ceremony," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Have you considered that the restraining order might not be legally enforceable?" "What do you mean?" "The order was issued by a county judge based on a petition from private citizens," Mrs. Patterson explained. "But federal law protects Native American religious practices, including access to sacred sites. A good civil rights lawyer might be able to challenge the restraining order on constitutional grounds." Chloe felt a spark of hope. "Do you know any civil rights lawyers?" "I might," Mrs. Patterson replied. "My sister works for the ACLU in Omaha. She's handled several cases involving religious freedom and indigenous rights." That afternoon, Chloe found herself in the school library researching federal laws protecting Native American religious practices. What she discovered was both encouraging and complex. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act did provide some protections for tribal ceremonies, but the law was vaguely written and often difficult to enforce, especially when it conflicted with private property rights. More promising was the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which prohibited government actions that substantially burdened religious exercise. A restraining order that prevented Native Americans from accessing traditional sacred sites might violate this federal law. Armed with this information, Chloe made another decision that would have seemed impossible. Just weeks earlier, she called Jesse and arranged to meet him at a neutral location, the public library in town, to discuss legal options for challenging the restraining order. Jesse arrived looking haggard and exhausted, the strain of his grandmother's illness evident in his posture and expression. They found a quiet corner of the library where they could talk without being overheard. "How is your grandmother?" Chloe asked immediately. "Worse," Jesse replied simply. "The doctors say she might have 48 hours left. She keeps drifting in and out of consciousness, but when she's awake, she asks about the ceremony." Chloe explained what she'd learned about federal laws, protecting religious freedom, and the possibility of challenging the restraining order. Jesse listened intently, but his expression remained skeptical. "Even if we could challenge the order legally, there's no time," Jesse pointed out. "Court cases take months or years. My grandmother will be gone long before any judge rules on religious freedom. Then we have to find another way," Chloe said with determination that surprised them both. Jesse studied her face carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that gets you in trouble," Chloe replied. "Your grandmother said the right path reveals itself when we're brave enough to take the first step." "Chloe, you can't be suggesting ... "I'm suggesting that there are higher laws than restraining orders," Chloe interrupted. "And I'm suggesting that if Margaret Crowfeather dies without her ceremony, I'll never forgive myself for not trying to help." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, clearly torn between hope and concern for Chloe's welfare. "If we do this, if we perform the ceremony without official permission, you could face serious legal consequences." Your father could press charges for trespassing, violating the restraining order, any number of things. Let me worry about my father, Chloe said with more confidence than she felt. The question is whether your people would be willing to perform the ceremony under these circumstances. Jesse's eyes brightened for the first time since their conversation began. If you're truly willing to take that risk, I can have 20 tribal members at your creek tomorrow night. My grandmother might not be physically present, but she could participate spiritually if she knows the ceremony is happening. As they made plans for what would essentially be an act of civil disobedience, Chloe felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For weeks, she'd been torn between competing loyalties and conflicting moral imperatives. Now finally, she knew exactly what she had to do. "Jesse," she said as they prepared to leave the library, "there's something I need you to understand. After tomorrow night, my life here is probably over. My father will never forgive me, and the community will see me as a traitor. I'm okay with that, but I need to know it's worth it." Jesse reached across the table and took her hand, the first time they'd touched since that morning when she'd helped him to the kitchen chair. "Chloe Whitfield," he said solemnly, "what you're doing will be remembered by our people for generations. Your courage will become part of our oral history, told around winter fires to children who haven't been born yet." "And after the ceremony?" Chloe asked. "What happens to me then?" Jesse's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you want to happen. There's a place for you with our people if you want it. Not as a charity case or an outsider, but as someone who proved herself worthy of our respect and trust." The implications of Jesse's words slowly sank in. He wasn't just talking about performing a ceremony. He was offering her a way to belong somewhere, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind. "I need to think about that," Chloe said quietly. "Of course," Jesse agreed, "but think quickly. Tomorrow night changes everything, one way or another." As Chloe drove home through the autumn twilight, she understood that she was approaching the point of no return. In 24 hours, she would either be the daughter who obeyed her father's wishes or the young woman who chose justice over safety. There would be no middle ground, no compromise position that satisfied everyone. The farm looked peaceful in the gathering darkness, its familiar buildings and fence lines representing 4 generations of Whitfield family history. Soon, very soon, she would have to decide whether that history was worth preserving at the cost of perpetuating an injustice that had festered for over a century. Tomorrow night, under the autumn full moon, Margaret Crowfeather's spirit would return to the sacred waters of her childhood, regardless of restraining orders or family disapproval. The only question remaining was whether Chloe would have the courage to stand with her when the moment came. The day of the full moon dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the Nebraska prairie. Chloe went through her normal routine, feeding the livestock, attending classes, completing her chores, while her heart hammered with nervous anticipation. Tonight, everything would change, and there would be no going back. She'd spent the previous evening writing letters that she hoped she'd never have to send. One to her parents, explaining her decision and asking for their eventual forgiveness. Another to her best friend Sarah, asking her to remember their friendship kindly. A third to her guidance counselor, requesting that her college application materials be forwarded to her if she had to leave town suddenly. The letters sat hidden in her dresser drawer like time bombs, waiting to detonate her old life if tonight went as badly as she feared it might at school. Chloe found it impossible to concentrate on lectures about calculus and English literature when her mind was occupied with thoughts of sacred ceremonies and civil disobedience. During lunch, she noticed several classmates whispering and pointing in her direction, and she realized that word of her involvement with the Crowfeather family had spread through the teenage gossip network. "Is it true?" her friend Ashley asked. During study hall, her voice carefully low. "Are you really helping those Indians with some kind of protest?" "It's not a protest," Chloe replied quietly. "It's a religious ceremony for a dying woman. My dad says they're just trying to cause trouble to make white people feel guilty about stuff that happened 100 years ago," Ashley continued. "He says you're being used." Chloe looked at her longtime friend and realized that their relationship was about to become another casualty of the choice she'd made. "Maybe I am being used," she said finally. "But at least I'm being used for something that matters." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Ashley clearly uncomfortable and Chloe feeling more isolated than ever. By the end of the school day, she understood that her social connections were already beginning to fray. Even before the ceremony had taken place, that afternoon, Chloe received a phone call that nearly shattered her resolve. Jesse's voice was thick with grief and exhaustion as he delivered news she'd been dreading. "My grandmother died this morning," he said simply. "She passed away in her sleep around 10 o'clock. Chloe felt the world tilt around her. "Jesse, I'm so sorry. Does this mean... Is the ceremony canceled?" "No," Jesse replied with surprising firmness. "If anything, it's more important now. My grandmother's spirit needs to be properly released to join our ancestors, and that can only happen if the ceremony is performed at the sacred site. But she won't be there to see it." "She'll be there," Jesse assured her. "In our tradition, the spirit remains close to the physical world for 4 days after death. Tonight is her last chance to return to the place where she was born." The weight of this responsibility settled over Chloe like a heavy cloak. What had been a gesture of kindness toward a dying woman had become a sacred obligation to help guide a soul to its final rest. "Are you sure you still want to do this?" Jesse asked gently. "I'll understand if Margaret's death changes things for you." "It doesn't change anything," Chloe said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "If Margaret needs this ceremony to find peace, then we'll give it to her." That evening, as the sun set behind the western horizon, Chloe sat in her bedroom, watching her parents through the window. They were on the front porch, her father reading his agricultural magazine while her mother worked on a crossword puzzle. It was a scene of such ordinary domestic tranquility that it made her heart ache. In 2 hours, she would walk out of this house and betray everything her father believed in. By morning, she might be homeless, facing criminal charges and cut off from everyone she'd ever loved. The magnitude of what she was about to do terrified her, but the alternative, allowing Margaret Crowfeather's spirit to wander without proper ceremony, seemed even worse. At 9 o'clock, Chloe slipped out of the house through the kitchen door, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain her parents would hear it. She'd left a note on her pillow explaining her actions and apologizing for the pain she was about to cause, but she hoped they wouldn't discover it until morning. The walk to the creek took 15 minutes, following a path she'd traveled countless times in daylight, but which seemed transformed in the moonlight. Every shadow could hide a neighbor who might report her activities to her father. Every sound could be Sheriff Morrison coming to arrest her for violating the restraining order. But when she reached the clearing beside the creek, all her fears evaporated in the face of what she found waiting there. 23 members of the Crowfeather extended family had gathered in a circle around a small fire built on the creek bank. Men, women, and children of all ages sat quietly, their faces painted with traditional designs and their bodies wrapped in blankets decorated with intricate beadwork. The scene looked like something from a historical photograph, except for the very real grief that emanated from the assembled group. Jesse approached her immediately, his appearance transformed by face paint and traditional clothing that emphasized his native heritage. "Chloe," he said formally, "on behalf of the Crowfeather family and the Ponca Nation, I thank you for your courage in allowing us to honor our grandmother in the proper way." An elderly man who Chloe recognized as Jesse's uncle stepped forward, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft leather. "This belonged to Margaret," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal an intricately beaded dress. She wanted it to be worn during the ceremony by someone who showed her kindness. Chloe stared at the beautiful garment, understanding the significance of what was being offered. "I can't wear that. I'm not Panka." "Tonight you are one of us," Jesse's uncle replied. Margaret's spirit requested it specifically. With trembling hands, Chloe accepted the dress and stepped behind a group of women who helped her change into the traditional garment. The beadwork was even more intricate up close, telling stories in geometric patterns that had been passed down through generations of skilled artisans. When she emerged wearing Margaret's dress, a murmur of approval rippled through the gathered family. An ancient woman who introduced herself as Margaret's sister approached with a small pot of paint. "May I?" the woman asked, gesturing toward Chloe's face. Chloe nodded, standing perfectly still as gentle fingers traced traditional designs on her cheeks and forehead. The paint felt cool against her skin, and she found herself thinking about all the young Panka women who had undergone similar rituals in this exact spot over the centuries. The ceremony began with drumming, a deep rhythmic sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The assembled family members began singing in their native language, voices rising and falling in harmonies that spoke of joy and sorrow intertwined. Jesse stood beside the fire, his voice carrying over the others as he called out words that Chloe couldn't understand but felt in her bones. The song spoke of homecoming and farewell, of spirits traveling between worlds, of love that transcended the boundaries between life and death. As the ceremony progressed, Chloe found herself drawn into the ancient rhythms despite her unfamiliarity with the specific traditions. When the family members stood to dance in a slow circle around the fire, she joined them without being asked, her feet finding the pattern as if she'd known it all her life. At the ceremony's climax, Jesse produced a small bundle of sage that he lit from the sacred fire. The aromatic smoke drifted across the creek, carrying with it prayers for Margaret's peaceful transition to the spirit world. Each family member took turns speaking Margaret's name and sharing a memory, their words a tapestry of love and loss. When Jessie indicated that Chloe should speak, she felt momentarily paralyzed. What could she say about a woman she'd known for such a brief time, in front of people who had loved her for decades? "Margaret Crowfeather taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Chloe said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "It's doing what's right, even when you're terrified. She showed me that some things are more important than safety, more valuable than comfort. Tonight, I hope her spirit knows that her lessons won't be forgotten." The ceremony concluded with a final song that seemed to last forever, voices rising toward the star-filled sky in a harmony that spoke of centuries of tradition and continuity. As the last notes faded, the family members began to embrace each other and prepare for departure, their sacred obligation fulfilled. But as they gathered their belongings, the sound of vehicles approaching on the farm road shattered the peaceful conclusion. Headlights blazed through the trees as Sheriff Morrison's patrol car led a convoy that included Robert Whitfield's truck, Mayor Thompson's sedan, and City Attorney Bradley's SUV. Chloe felt her stomach drop as she realized that someone had discovered the ceremony and alerted the authorities. The confrontation she'd been dreading was about to begin, and there would be no escape from the consequences of her choice. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his patrol car with his hand resting on his service weapon, clearly uncertain about what he might be facing. The other men followed, their expressions ranging from anger to outright hostility. "This is an unlawful assembly in violation of a county restraining order," Sheriff Morrison announced formally. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately." Robert Whitfield pushed past the sheriff, his face twisted with rage and betrayal as he spotted his daughter in traditional Ponca dress standing beside the dying fire. "Chloe Elizabeth Whitfield," he shouted, his voice carrying across the creek. "What in God's name have you done?" The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there would be no hiding behind good intentions or noble motivations. Chloe had made her choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Standing beside Jessie and surrounded by the Crow-Feather family, wearing Margaret's sacred dress and painted with traditional designs, Chloe understood that she had already crossed a line from which there might be no return. The girl who had fed a hungry boy at her gate just weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for justice and compassion. I honored a dying woman's last wish, Chloe called back to her father, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her painted cheeks. I helped her spirit find peace. You betrayed your own family, Robert replied, his voice breaking with pain and fury. For these people, you betrayed everything we've built. As the two sides faced each other across the creek that had once been called Singing Waters, Chloe realized that this confrontation was about much more than a single ceremony, or even her personal rebellion. It was about the fundamental question of whether healing was possible between communities that had been wounded by history, whether understanding could bridge the gap created by generations of mistrust and injustice. The answer would determine not only her immediate future, but the kind of person she would become and the legacy she would leave for others facing similar choices between safety and courage, between loyalty and justice. The standoff beside Singing Waters Creek stretched into tense minutes as both sides assessed their positions. Sheriff Morrison stood with his hand still resting on his weapon, clearly uncertain about how to handle a situation that involved religious freedom, property rights, and a county restraining order. The Ponca family members remained in their ceremonial circle, their dignity unshaken despite the aggressive interruption. Robert Whitfield took a step closer to the creek, his anger seeming to build with each moment he stared at his daughter. Take off that costume, Chloe. Take it off right now and come home where you belong. This isn't a costume, Dad, Chloe replied, her voice steadier than she felt. This dress belonged to Margaret Crow-Feather. She wanted me to wear it during her funeral ceremony. Funeral ceremony? Mayor Thompson stepped forward, his political instincts sensing a public relations disaster. You mean this woman is dead? Jessie's uncle, who had been silent since the authorities arrived, spoke with calm authority. My sister passed into the spirit world this morning. We performed the traditional 4-day ceremony to guide her soul to our ancestors. City Attorney Bradley immediately recognized the legal implications. Sheriff, if this was a funeral service, we may have violated federal religious protection laws by interrupting it. It doesn't matter what kind of service it was, Robert shouted. They're trespassing on my property in violation of a court order. Dr. Monroe emerged from the shadows. Beyond the fire, her presence adding another unexpected element to the confrontation. She'd been documenting the ceremony for her research, and her academic credentials carried weight even with hostile local officials. Gentlemen, Dr. Monroe said formally, what you've interrupted is a constitutionally protected religious ceremony, conducted on land that holds sacred significance for the Ponca Nation. The restraining order you're citing may itself be unconstitutional under federal law. Sheriff Morrison looked between the various authorities, clearly out of his depth. This is getting complicated. Maybe we should call the state attorney general's office before anyone does anything irreversible. The only irreversible thing here is my daughter's betrayal, Robert said bitterly. Chloe, for the last time, come home now or face the consequences. Chloe looked across the creek at her father, seeing the pain beneath his anger. This confrontation was breaking his heart as much as hers, but there was no path back to their old relationship. Too much had been revealed, too many truths acknowledged. I can't, Dad, she said quietly. Not until you understand why this matters. I understand perfectly, Robert replied. You've chosen strangers over your own family. You've violated everything I taught you about loyalty and respect. Jessie stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Chloe in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "Mr. Whitfield, your daughter showed more honor tonight than most people show in a lifetime. She risked everything to help my grandmother's spirit find peace." "Don't you dare lecture me about my own daughter," Robert snarled, taking another step toward the creek. "You're the one who filled her head with this nonsense about sacred sites and ancient rites." "The rites aren't ancient," Jesse replied calmly. "They're current federal law. And the sacred sites are real, whether you acknowledge them or not." The confrontation might have escalated into violence if not for the arrival of 2 additional vehicles that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The first was an unmarked sedan carrying federal agents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who had been monitoring the legal challenges to the county restraining order. The second was a van from the regional television station, complete with camera crew, and reporter. Agent Sarah Collins from the BA immediately took charge of the situation, her federal authority superseding local officials. "Everyone needs to remain calm while we sort out the jurisdictional issues here." The television crew began setting up equipment, their bright lights transforming the sacred ceremony site into something resembling a crime scene. Reporter Kevin Walsh started interviewing anyone willing to talk, sensing a story with statewide implications. "This is a disaster," Mayor Thompson muttered to City Attorney Bradley. "If this gets on the evening news, we'll have protesters and activists swarming the county." Agent Collins approached Jesse and his family with respectful professionalism. "I'm sorry for your loss and for the disruption of your ceremony. We received a complaint about potential violations of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act." "Who filed the complaint?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "Mrs. Patterson from the High School contacted my office this afternoon," Agent Collins replied. "She was concerned that the restraining order might violate federal law protecting Native American religious practices." Chloe felt a surge of gratitude toward her teacher, who had apparently been working behind the scenes to provide legal protection for the ceremony. Mrs. Patterson's intervention might have saved them all from serious criminal charges. The television reporter approached Chloe, microphone extended. "Miss Whitfield, can you tell us why you decided to help with this ceremony, despite local opposition?" Before Chloe could answer, Robert stepped into the camera frame. "My daughter is 17 years old and has been manipulated by people with their own agenda. Anything she says should be considered the words of a confused child." "I'm not confused," Chloe said firmly, accepting the microphone. "I helped because Margaret Crowfeather was a dying woman who wanted to return to her homeland one last time. Anyone with basic human decency would have done the same thing." The reporter pressed for more details. "Are you aware that your actions tonight could face legal challenges?" "I'm aware that some things are more important than legal technicalities," Chloe replied. "Margaret Crowfeather's family lived on this land for centuries before my family arrived. The least we could do was allow her spirit to say goodbye properly." Agent Collins intervened before the interview could continue. "Everyone needs to understand that this situation involves complex federal laws and tribal sovereignty issues. Any statements made tonight could affect ongoing legal proceedings." As the various officials huddled to discuss jurisdictional questions, Jesse approached Chloe with an expression of deep concern. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. If you want to go home with your father, no one will think less of you." Chloe looked around at the scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents consulting law books, local officials arguing about authority, television cameras recording everything for posterity. Her old life seemed to be dissolving in real time, but she felt strangely calm about the transformation. "I can't go back, Jesse," she said. "Even if my father forgives me, even if the legal issues get resolved, I can't pretend I don't know what I know now." "What do you know?" "I know that my family's prosperity was built on someone else's loss. I know that silence about injustice makes you complicit in perpetuating it. And I know that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Jesse's expression grew sad. I never wanted you to lose your family because of us. I'm not losing my family because of you, Chloe corrected. I'm losing them because they can't accept the person I've become. That's their choice, not yours. The discussion among the officials was growing heated, with Agent Collins insisting that federal law took precedence over local restraining orders, while Sheriff Morrison argued that property rights couldn't be ignored even for religious ceremonies. Dr. Monroe provided crucial context by explaining the historical significance of the site and the legal precedents for protecting Native American sacred places. Her academic credentials and documented research gave weight to arguments that might otherwise have been dismissed as activist rhetoric. The courts have consistently ruled that sincere religious beliefs deserve protection, even when they conflict with local ordinances, Dr. Monroe explained. The ceremony tonight falls clearly within the parameters of constitutionally protected religious exercise. City Attorney Bradley countered that private property rights were equally protected under the Constitution, and that allowing religious ceremonies on private land without owner consent would set a dangerous precedent. The legal arguments continued for over an hour while the Ponca family members waited patiently for resolution. Several of the elders had brought folding chairs, suggesting they were prepared for a lengthy confrontation. Their calm dignity contrasted sharply with the agitation of the local officials. Finally, Agent Collins announced her decision. Based on federal law and the religious nature of tonight's ceremony, I'm ruling that no criminal charges will be filed related to the gathering itself. However, the broader issues around property rights and sacred site access will need to be resolved through proper legal channels. Sheriff Morrison looked frustrated but nodded acceptance of the federal agent's authority. What about the restraining order? The restraining order appears to be in violation of federal religious freedom protections, Agent Collins replied. I'll be recommending that the State Attorney General's office review its constitutionality. Robert Whitfield had listened to the legal discussions with growing anger and helplessness. The authorities who should have been supporting his property rights were instead deferring to federal officials who seemed more concerned with Native American claims than landowner interests. This is insane, he declared loudly enough for the television cameras to record. These people show up on my land without permission, violate a court order, and now the federal government is protecting them instead of arresting them. The reporter immediately focused on Robert's outburst. Mr. Whitfield, how do you respond to claims that this land holds sacred significance for Native Americans? I respond that my family has legal title to this property, purchased and paid for according to law, Robert said angrily. If these people have claims to my land, let them take it to court instead of conducting midnight ceremonies without permission. But sir, your daughter gave permission for the ceremony. Doesn't she have some say in how family property is used? The question seemed to hit Robert like a physical blow. He turned to stare at Chloe with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. She's 17 years old, he said finally. She has no legal authority to make decisions about family property. But she has moral authority, Jesse interjected, stepping forward to face the television camera. Chloe Whitfield proved tonight that she understands something her father doesn't, that legal ownership and moral responsibility aren't always the same thing. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of yet another vehicle, this one carrying Linda Whitfield, who had apparently discovered Chloe's note and driven to the farm to find her family in crisis. She emerged from her car looking confused and frightened by the scene of official vehicles and television cameras. Robert, what's happening? Linda called out as she approached the group. Chloe left a note saying she was helping with a funeral ceremony, and then I found all these cars ... Robert's composure finally cracked completely. Your daughter betrayed us. Linda, she violated a court order to help these people conduct illegal ceremonies on our property. Linda looked across the creek at Chloe, taking in the traditional dress and face paint with an expression that was impossible to read. For a long moment, mother and daughter stared at each other across a divide that seemed to encompass far more than the narrow stream between them. "Chloe," Linda said finally, her voice barely audible above the murmur of official conversations, "are you all right?" The simple question, asked with genuine maternal concern rather than judgment, nearly broke Chloe's carefully maintained composure. "I'm okay, Mom. I did what I thought was right." Linda nodded slowly, as if processing information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her daughter. The note said the woman died, Margaret Crowfeather. "This morning," Chloe confirmed. The ceremony was to help her spirit find peace. Linda was quiet for another long moment, her gaze moving from Chloe to the assembled Ponca family members, to the dying fire that had been the center of their sacred ritual. When she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone present. "Then I'm glad you were here to help her," Linda said simply. "No one should die alone, away from the places they love." Robert stared at his wife with shock and growing anger. "Linda, you can't be serious. You can't approve of what she's done." "I don't approve or disapprove," Linda replied calmly. "I just recognize that our daughter has grown into someone with her own moral compass. Whether we like her decisions or not, we have to respect that she's making them based on her own understanding of right and wrong." The television reporter sensed a dramatic family reconciliation and moved closer with her microphone. But Agent Collins intervened to prevent further media exploitation of private family dynamics. "That's enough interviews for tonight, Agent," Collins announced. "This family needs space to work through their issues without television cameras recording every word." As the camera crew reluctantly packed their equipment, the various officials began making preparations for departure. The immediate crisis had been resolved without arrests or violence, but the underlying conflicts remained unaddressed. Jesse approached Chloe one final time before the gathering dispersed completely. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Chloe looked around at the scene of her transformation, the sacred fire burning low, her parents separated by more than physical distance, federal agents discussing constitutional law while local officials planned their next moves. Her old life lay in ruins, but something new was being born from the ashes. "Now I find out who I really am," she said, "and where I really belong." The morning after the ceremony dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the Nebraska prairie like a reflection of the somber mood that had settled over the Whitfield farm. Chloe sat at the kitchen table, still wearing Margaret's traditional dress, unwilling to change out of it until she understood what her decision truly meant for her future. Robert hadn't spoken to her since returning from the creek the night before. He'd stormed into the house, slammed his bedroom door, and remained there while Linda made coffee and tried to process the events that had transformed their quiet family into the center of a regional controversy. The first phone call came at 6:30 in the morning, followed by dozens more throughout the day. Reporters wanting interviews, activists offering support, neighbors expressing outrage, and strangers from across the country who had seen the television coverage and felt compelled to share their opinions about Native American rights and property ownership. Linda fielded most of the calls, protecting Chloe from the barrage of attention while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy was clearly impossible when satellite news trucks began arriving in their driveway and protesters gathered at the end of their road. "Channel 7 is requesting an exclusive interview," Linda reported after hanging up the phone. "They want to film here at the farm, show the actual site where the ceremony took place." "No interviews," Robert's voice came from the doorway, where he stood looking haggard and defeated. "No cameras, no reporters, no more publicity. This family has been through enough." "Dad," Chloe began, but Robert cut her off with a sharp gesture. Just don't say anything right now. I can't handle hearing you defend what you did." The silence that followed was broken by another phone call. This one from Mrs. Patterson at the high school. She'd received word that the school board was planning an emergency meeting to discuss Chloe's involvement in the ceremony and its potential impact on the district's reputation. They can't punish a student for exercising her constitutional rights, Mrs. Patterson explained when Linda put the call on speaker. But there are board members who consider Chloe's actions disruptive to the educational environment. What does that mean? Chloe asked. It means some people want you suspended or expelled as an example to other students, Mrs. Patterson replied honestly. I'm fighting it, but I wanted you to be prepared. After the call ended, Chloe realized that the consequences of her decision were rippling outward in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her education, her family's business relationships, their standing in the community, everything was at risk because she'd chosen to honor a dying woman's final wish. Around noon, Jesse arrived with several tribal elders, their presence drawing immediate attention from the news crews camped at the end of the driveway. They approached the house with ceremonial dignity, carrying gifts and formal documentation that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Robert emerged from his self-imposed isolation to meet them on the front porch, his expression guarded and hostile. What do you want now? Jesse's uncle, who had spoken at the ceremony, stepped forward with formal courtesy. Mr. Whitfield, we come to honor your daughter for her courage and to offer her a place among our people if she chooses to accept it. She's not your people, Robert replied bluntly. She's my daughter, and she belongs here with her family. Belonging is not always about blood, the elder said gently. Sometimes it's about shared values and mutual respect. Your daughter has shown herself worthy of adoption into the Crow Feather clan. The formal offer of tribal adoption was unprecedented in the region's modern history. It meant that Chloe would be granted full membership in the Ponca Nation, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed, including access to tribal lands, educational benefits, and cultural teachings. What exactly are you proposing? Linda asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jesse spoke for the first time since arriving. We're proposing that Chloe be formally recognized as a daughter of the Ponca people. She would keep her legal name and citizenship, but she would also become part of our extended family. And what would that involve? Chloe asked, her heart racing with the implications of such an offer. Cultural education, participation in tribal ceremonies, and eventually, if she chooses, training as a keeper of traditional knowledge, Jesse's uncle explained. Your actions last night prove that you understand the responsibility that comes with honoring our ancestors. Robert's composure cracked completely. You're trying to steal my daughter. First you fill her head with guilt about ancient history. Then you manipulate her into betraying her own family. And now you want to make her one of you. We're offering her a choice, Jesse replied calmly. The same choice every young person faces when they reach adulthood. The choice of who they want to become and where they want to belong. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of City Attorney Bradley, who had come to serve formal legal papers. The county was filing civil charges against everyone who had participated in the previous night's ceremony, seeking damages for violation of the restraining order and trespassing on private property. This is political grandstanding, Dr. Monroe said as she emerged from her car behind Bradley. She'd apparently been monitoring the situation and arrived to provide legal support. Federal agents already ruled that the ceremony was constitutionally protected. Federal agents don't have authority over local civil matters, Bradley replied smugly. Property rights violations are handled by county courts, not federal officials. As the adults argued about legal jurisdictions and constitutional protections, Chloe found herself studying the faces of the Ponca elders who had come to offer her adoption into their tribe. These people barely knew her, yet they were willing to claim her as family based on her actions during a single night. The contrast with her own father's rejection was stark and painful. Robert saw her decision as betrayal, while the Ponca saw it as proof of character. One community was trying to punish her for moral courage, while another was offering to reward it with belonging and acceptance. "I need time to think about all this," Chloe said finally, addressing both the legal challenges and the adoption offer. "Everything is happening too fast." "Time is something we may not have," Jesse warned. "The county is moving quickly to criminalize what we did last night. If you're going to accept our protection through tribal membership, it needs to happen soon." "Tribal membership doesn't protect anyone from local law," Bradley interjected. "She's still subject to county jurisdiction, regardless of any adoption ceremony." Dr. Monroe pulled out her phone and showed them a news article that had just been published. "Actually, the state attorney general's office just announced they're reviewing the restraining order for potential constitutional violations. Any prosecutions based on that order are being suspended pending their investigation." The news provided temporary relief, but everyone understood that the legal battles were just beginning. The case had attracted attention from civil rights organizations, property rights advocates, and Native American activists across the country. What had started as a personal family conflict was becoming a test case for fundamental questions about religious freedom, cultural preservation, and historical justice. That afternoon, a delegation from the American Civil Liberties Union arrived to offer legal representation for anyone facing charges related to the ceremony. They were followed by representatives from a conservative legal foundation who wanted to defend property rights against what they characterized as federal overreach. "This is turning into a circus," Robert complained as he watched the stream of visitors and media crews from his living room window. "Our family's private business has become a national political issue." "Maybe that's not entirely bad," Linda said quietly, speaking more directly than she had since the crisis began. "Maybe some issues are bigger than one family's privacy." Robert turned to stare at his wife with disbelief. "You're taking their side too? Against your own husband and the land we've worked our whole lives to build?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Linda replied. "I'm trying to understand how we got to the point where showing kindness to a dying woman is considered betrayal." The argument that followed was the worst fight Robert and Linda had ever had. With 30 years of suppressed disagreements about community, justice, and moral responsibility finally erupting into open conflict. Chloe listened from the kitchen, realizing that her decision had exposed fault lines in her parents' marriage that had probably existed for years. Evening brought a temporary respite from the chaos when most of the media crews departed to file their stories for the nightly news broadcasts. The family gathered around the television to watch themselves become the lead story on multiple channels. Their private crisis transformed into public entertainment. The coverage was generally sympathetic to Chloe's actions, framing the story as a young woman's courage in standing up for indigenous rights against local prejudice. But there were also segments that portrayed her as a naive teenager manipulated by activists with their own agenda. "Look what you've done," Robert said as they watched footage of the ceremony. The television cameras making the sacred ritual appear theatrical and staged. "You've turned Margaret Crow Feather's funeral into a media spectacle." "I didn't invite the cameras," Chloe protested. "They came because people called them." "People called them because you gave them something to call about." Robert shot back. "If you'd minded your own business, none of this would have happened." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jesse stood on the porch alone, his expression serious and urgent. "I need to tell you something," he said when Chloe let him in. "The tribal council met this afternoon to discuss your situation. They've made a decision that affects everything." "What kind of decision?" Linda asked. Jesse took a deep breath before continuing. "They've voted to formally claim the creek area as a sacred site under federal law. They're filing papers tomorrow to establish it as a place of religious significance that requires protection." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If the tribal council succeeded in establishing legal recognition of the sacred site, It would severely restrict what the Whitfield family could do with that portion of their land. No development, no agricultural modifications, possibly even restrictions on access. "You planned this," Robert said, his voice deadly quiet. "The whole thing was a setup to steal our land through legal technicalities." "It wasn't planned," Jesse insisted. "The council made this decision because they realized the site could be lost forever if they don't act now. Your daughter's courage inspired them to fight for what they should have fought for decades ago." "My daughter's stupidity, you mean," Robert replied bitterly. "She opened the door to claims that could destroy this farm." Chloe felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lid blanket. Her decision to help Margaret Crow Feather had triggered consequences that could indeed threaten her family's livelihood and the foundation of their community's economy. "There might be a solution," Jesse said carefully. "The tribal council is willing to negotiate a cooperative agreement that protects the sacred site while allowing your family to continue farming the rest of the property." "What kind of agreement?" Linda asked. "Joint stewardship. The Ponca Nation would hold ceremonial rights to the creek area, while your family maintains ownership and farming rights to the rest of the land. It would actually protect you from future development pressure and provide tax benefits through the Cultural Preservation Program." Robert laughed harshly. "Joint stewardship with people who claim my property was stolen from them. That sounds like a recipe for endless conflict." "Or endless cooperation," Jesse replied. "Your daughter proved that our peoples can work together when we focus on shared values instead of historical grievances." As the evening wore on, the various proposals and legal challenges swirled around Chloe like competing storm systems. The tribal adoption offer, the county's civil charges, the sacred site claim, the joint stewardship proposal, each carried the potential to transform her life in fundamental ways. But underneath all the legal and political complexities lay a simpler question: where did she truly belong? With the family that had raised her but couldn't accept her choices, or with the community that embraced her courage but represented a complete break from everything familiar? The answer would determine not only her immediate future, but the kind of person she would become and the legacy she would leave for others facing similar choices between safety and justice, between tradition and transformation. 3 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across the transformed landscape of the Whitfield farm, where a remarkable ceremony was about to take place. The legal battles had been resolved through federal mediation, resulting in an unprecedented agreement that satisfied most parties involved. The creek area had been officially designated as a protected sacred site under joint stewardship between the Ponca Nation and the Whitfield family, while the farming operation continued on the remaining acreage. Chloe stood beside Singing Waters Creek wearing a new dress, one that blended traditional Ponca beadwork with contemporary design, symbolizing the bridge she had become between two communities. Today was her formal adoption ceremony into the Crow Feather clan, an event that had drawn hundreds of tribal members, local residents, and media representatives who had followed her story from its dramatic beginning. Robert Whitfield worked quietly near the barn, his presence at the ceremony representing the most difficult compromise of all. The past months had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about history, justice, and his own prejudices. While he couldn't bring himself to fully embrace what Chloe had done, he'd eventually reached a grudging acceptance of her choices and their consequences. The transformation hadn't been easy for anyone. The county's civil lawsuit had been dropped after federal investigators found the restraining order unconstitutional. But the legal fees and media attention had strained the Whitfield family's resources and relationships. Several neighbors remained hostile to the arrangement, viewing it as a dangerous precedent that could threaten property rights throughout the region. However, unexpected benefits had emerged from the controversy. The joint stewardship agreement included federal grants for sustainable agriculture practices that had improved the farm's profitability. Educational tourism related to the sacred site brought visitors who purchased products from local businesses. Most importantly, the cooperative relationship between the Ponca Nation and area farmers had prevented the costly legal battles that had plagued similar situations in other states. Jesse approached Chloe as she prepared for the ceremony, his role as a medicine keeper now officially recognized by the tribal council. The sacred rituals he'd learned through his connection to the ancestral site had made him one of the youngest spiritual leaders in Ponca history. "Are you ready?" he asked, noting the mixture of nervousness and excitement in her expression. "As ready as someone can be for becoming a completely different person," Chloe replied with a smile that had become more confident over the months of cultural education and tribal integration. Linda Whitfield emerged from the farmhouse carrying a tray of food for the post-ceremony feast, her relationship with her daughter having grown stronger through the crisis that had initially threatened to tear their family apart. She'd become an unexpected ally in bridging the gap between the farming community and the Ponca Nation, using her social connections to build understanding and cooperation. "Your father's struggling with this," Linda told Chloe quietly. "But he'll come around eventually. He's already started attending the cultural education sessions that Dr. Monroe organizes." The ceremony began with traditional drumming and singing, the ancient rhythms echoing across land that had witnessed countless such rituals over the centuries. Tribal elders spoke in their native language, welcoming Chloe into the clan with words that carried the weight of sacred tradition. When it came time for Chloe to speak, she addressed the assembled crowd in both English and the Ponca phrases she'd been learning, her words carrying across the creek to where Robert stood listening. "Despite himself, 3 months ago, I thought helping a hungry boy was just basic human kindness," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong. "I had no idea it would lead to discovering truths about history, justice, and my own capacity for courage." Margaret Crow Feather taught me that belonging isn't always about blood or birthplace. Sometimes it's about shared values and the willingness to stand up for what's right. She turned to look directly at her father. "I'm still Chloe Whitfield, daughter of Robert and Linda, 4th-generation Nebraska farmer. But I'm also now Singing Bird, daughter of the Crow Feather clan, keeper of stories that bridge 2 communities. Both identities are real, and both are necessary." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a sacred eagle feather, marking Chloe's full acceptance into the tribe. As the crowd dispersed for the feast, Robert finally approached his daughter, his expression complex but no longer hostile. "I still don't understand all of this," he said quietly, "and I'm not sure I ever will. But I can see that you found something important here, something that makes you happy." "Dad, I never wanted to hurt you or reject our family," Chloe replied. "I just couldn't ignore what I learned about this place and its history." Robert nodded slowly. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe someone needed to ask the hard questions that the rest of us were too comfortable to ask." Jesse joined them, extending his hand to Robert in a gesture of respect and reconciliation. "Mr. Whitfield, I want you to know that we consider your family to be permanent partners in protecting this sacred site. Your daughter's courage made that possible." "My daughter has always been braver than her old man," Robert admitted, shaking Jesse's hand with surprising warmth. "I'm learning that courage sometimes means admitting when you're wrong." As the celebration continued into the evening, Chloe found herself moving easily between the 2 communities that now claimed her as their own. Farming neighbors who had initially opposed the arrangement found themselves genuinely enjoying conversations with tribal members about sustainable agriculture and land management. Ponca elders shared stories with local children who had never heard the indigenous history of their own homeland. Dr. Monroe approached Chloe with news that would shape her immediate future. "The University of Nebraska has offered you a full scholarship to study cultural anthropology and indigenous law. They want you to document what's happened here as a model for other communities facing similar challenges." The scholarship offered an opportunity to turn her experience into expertise that could help others navigate the complex intersections of property rights, cultural preservation, and historical justice. It was a path she couldn't have imagined when she first found Jesse collapsed at their gate, but one that felt inevitable given everything that had followed. "What do you think?" Chloe asked Jesse, who had become not just her cultural teacher, but something much deeper during their months of working together. "I think you have a gift for building bridges between worlds," Jesse replied. "And I think the spirits of this place chose you for exactly that purpose." As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Chloe walked alone to the creek where everything had begun. The water continued its ancient song, carrying with it the memories of all who had lived beside its banks. Margaret Crowfeather's spirit had found peace here, and in doing so, had set in motion changes that transformed an entire community. The sacred site marker, installed as part of the joint stewardship agreement, reflected moonlight off its bronze surface. The inscription read, "Singing Water's Sacred Site, where the past informs the present and the present honors the past." Jesse found her there, carrying a blanket against the night chill. They sat together beside the water, two young people who had discovered that love could transcend cultural boundaries just as surely as justice could bridge historical divisions. "Do you ever regret it?" Jesse asked. "Everything that happened, everything that changed?" Chloe considered the question carefully, thinking about the family relationships that had been strained, the community conflicts that had erupted, the comfortable assumptions that had been shattered by uncomfortable truths. "I regret the pain it caused," she said finally, "but I don't regret the choice. Margaret Crowfeather needed to come home, and I was in a position to help her do that. Everything else that followed was just the consequence of doing what felt right. And now I have two families, two communities, and a responsibility to help them understand each other. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I was meant to live." Years later, when Chloe had become Dr. Chloe Whitfield Crowfeather, a renowned expert in indigenous rights and cultural preservation, she would return to Singing Waters Creek every autumn to perform the memorial ceremony for Margaret. The annual gathering became a celebration of cooperation between communities that had once seen each other as enemies. The Whitfield farm prospered under the joint stewardship agreement, becoming a model for sustainable agriculture that attracted visitors from around the world. Robert eventually became one of the program's most effective advocates, his transformation from skeptic to supporter inspiring other farmers to consider similar arrangements. Jesse and Chloe married in a ceremony that blended Ponca traditions with contemporary elements, their union symbolizing the possibility of harmony between different cultures and worldviews. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in farm fields and tribal ceremonies, carrying forward the legacy of bridge building that had begun with a simple act of kindness toward a hungry boy. The story of the farm girl who became a tribal queen spread far beyond Nebraska, inspiring others to question inherited assumptions and choose courage over comfort when confronted with injustice. But for those who knew her best, Chloe remained exactly what she'd always been, someone willing to feed the hungry, honor the dead, and stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. At Singing Waters Creek, where ancient traditions met modern realities, the water continued its eternal song, carrying forward the stories of all who had found healing, belonging, and hope along its sacred banks. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.